Hello everyone, this is Dr. Laura Davis and I'm going to do a short mini lecture today for you on Wallace Stevens' poem called The Snowman. And first thing I guess I'll mention is that The Snowman was written in the early 1900s, and so this is a different time period from the other poems that we've been studying in this class. And it's important to remember that because Stevens is considered a modernist poet, and you can sort of look up and do some research on modernism and literary modernism and the kinds of things that poets during that time period were doing with their poetry. Many of them were responding to Romanticism and poets of the previous generation, and they wanted to differentiate themselves from those poets. So although you will see some similarities between a poem like The Snowman and a poem like William Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, for example, the sense of the human consciousness in relation to nature, because they were written in different time periods, and in this case in different national contexts as well, because Stevens was American and Wordsworth was English, there are key differences in how the poetry is working and what it's doing. So I wanted to start with that. The other thing I will say here with this particular poem and with Stevens' poetry in general is that he is quite a philosophical poet. And I think one of the things the modernist poets were trying to do, or that the kinds of things they were thinking about, is in terms of literary modernism and modernism in general, which is the time period, by the way, from the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, so around 1900, up until, or actually I would say, depends, different critics situated at different times. Around 1900, some say, others say kind of a little bit later than that, a few years into the 20th century. So early 1900s till about the end of World War II, so around 1945, it's considered the modernist period. Post 1945 is considered postmodernism. And there were different things, different kind of artistic movements, different things that the artists were trying to do during that time period, which is always a response to the world around us and politics and context in general. So The Snowman is a philosophical poem. In terms of modernism, Stevens was one of those people who was kind of questioning the grounds for value. What grounds of value do we have? In modernist times, there was kind of a sense of despair, some critics argue, say because of the World Wars. And the fact that World War I was not going to be the war to end all wars. There was a sense of despair. There was a sense of questioning of the values that we had counted on. There was kind of a sense of, is there a God? You know, Nietzsche declared the death of God, for example. And all of these kinds of things were going on. So I think we have a little bit of that kind of existential angst, or that questioning about our grounds for value, is particularly at the end of this poem. One thing that I think, this poem and Wordsworth poem, they're very different poems in a lot of ways, but one thing that's kind of similar about the two of them is they both deal with human consciousness in relation to nature. And I think that's interesting in both of them. And we definitely get that kind of turn to philosophy, and turn to the idea of consciousness and the human mind in relation to one's environment, particularly at the end of The Snowman, all the way through, but it's really pronounced at the end where we get those philosophical lines in the last few lines of the poem. Okay, The Snowman. Now, I hope it's clear from reading the poem that the title doesn't refer to an actual snowman that's built like a kid would build a snowman, right? The snowman is, in a sense, the speaker of the poem. And note that when we're talking about poetry, we use the word speaker rather than narrator. When we're talking about short stories, we would use the word narrator. When we're talking about poems, we use the word speaker. So, and the speaker is not always the same as the poet. We need to differentiate between the two. Sometimes poems can be autobiographical, and often they are, but we don't want to assume that the speaker is the poet, okay? So just like we don't want to assume that the narrator of a story is the same as the author of the story, it's not, right? Because authors take different characters and narrate from different perspectives. And same sort of thing in poetry. There's the poet, and on the other hand, there's the speaker. They can be the same or they can be quite different, right? So we don't want to assume that the speaker is the poet, okay? But sometimes they are. So here we have the speaker of the poem at the very beginning, and it's a very kind of distanced kind of tone, right? It's not, what I mean by distance is impersonalized tone. Because of that word one must have the mind of winter. It's not like I have the mind of winter. The speaker's not saying that, or you should have the mind of winter. It's just this kind of generic, one must have the mind of winter. And we question, well, what does it mean to have a mind of winter? What is that, right? We don't know yet. But the sense that we get already is there's the human, the consciousness, the mind, and then there is something other than that, the environment, winter, seasons, maybe even time we can think of in that. So already we get this combination of human consciousness and one's environment, seasons, time, environment. So one must have the mind of winter, to regard the frost in the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time, okay? So have been cold a long time is interesting, because I think here there's kind of two meanings of being cold. On the one hand, there is the sense of actually being chilly, the temperature, one person's temperature being cold, because we're talking about winter. He's brought up winter. We're thinking about snow and cold, and he's brought up the snowman, right? The man who is made of snow. He's as cold as, he's been cold a long time. He is, the listener is the snowman, the speaker is the snowman. So on the one hand, it's just like chilliness. It's a cold temperature. But on the other hand, it means a kind of emotionless, right? If you're cold, you are emotionless. You are a cold person. You are not compassionate, right? So I think these two meanings of the word cold are being drawn upon here, both cold in the sense of temperature and cold in the emotional sense, like that sort of lack of emotion, right? So you must have been cold a long time, not you one. To behold junipers shagged with ice, the spruces roughed in distant glitter. And if you've watched the video by Paul Griffin, you'll know that he talks about the poem kind of stepping back, almost like a camera's moving back. So you see, it says here, the spruces rough in distant glitter, like we're distanced now from the stone. We're kind of the snow. We're kind of pulling back, as Paul Griffin says in his video. So you must have been cold a long time if you look around you and you see all of this stuff. And not to think of any misery, right? So again, we're getting this combination, and this is where there is some similarities to the Wordsworth poem. There's this combination of like the outer environment and the inner kind of human consciousness, right? You must be a very cold person if you can see all of this landscape, which is barren and cold and snowy, and not to see any misery in that. Right? And clearly the speaker, in a sense, feels the misery, and I think is kind of fighting against that misery, and sees and looks at the environment and then interprets it in terms of his own feelings of misery, even as he's trying not to, even as he's trying to maintain that distance. One must have a mind of winter, right? You must be cold. You must be cold if you can't see misery in this, right? He's kind of trying to distance himself from it at the same time that he's invoking that misery. Okay, of the January sun, and not to think of any misery, in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves. So here we have him kind of projecting his own sense of misery onto the landscape, right? He's hearing the sound of the wind. The listener is really important in this poem. The listener could be the reader. The listener is also the poet who listens to their surroundings. So the speaker is kind of projecting their own sense of misery onto the environment, right? They hear the sound of the wind, and they hear misery in it. They hear the sound of a few leaves, and they hear misery in that, because the speaker himself, I think, is feeling misery and is trying not to, but sees this in the landscape around. So the feelings of the poet, of the speaker, are being depicted by the landscape that he's describing. And then we have, which is the sound of the land full of the same wind that is blowing in the same place. For the listener who listens in the snow. So again, Paul Griffin talked about enjambment, and you can look up that word, but enjambment is, in a sense, moving. There's kind of line breaks, right? And then there's moving from one line to the next. And there's a sense of this kind of leaving off in one line and then it being enjammed into the next line, so that you have to read the next line in order to really get the full meaning. And Stevens is interesting because he does that even between stanzas, that you actually have to kind of go on to the next line of the next stanza to understand the full implications of that line. Okay, so then we're getting all this stuff is starting to be the same. We're getting this conflation of mind and environment, which is the sound of the land full of the same wind that's blowing in the same bare place. Well, the land doesn't really sound, does it? The wind hitting on things makes it sound. But we're getting all of this kind of, in a sense, just like the wind swirling together, right? And it's all becoming the same. It's the same kind of barren place that makes him think of his own misery. And then the final stanza says, for the listener who listens in the snow and nothing himself beholds, nothing that is not there and the nothing that is. And these are the lines that I think get the most, we want to talk about the most, that most critics talk about the most, because they are so provocative and so thought-provoking, right, and philosophical, and he really turns to philosophical language in this sense. So the listener, who is this listener? I think on the one hand we can interpret the listener as the poet, and on the other hand we can, or the speaker of the poem, and on the other hand we can interpret the listener as the reader of the poem, so us. Okay, and we're listening in the snow. We're the ones who have that mind of winter. And nothing himself, right? So then you have to think of the self as nothing. You are simply the beholder. You are simply one who takes in the environment around you. And there's a kind of nothingness here. Beholds nothing out there, right? So this kind of conflation of, which is the sound of the land, the same sound as the wind, this kind of conflation of place, everything's kind of collapsing into each other here to become this kind of nothingness, right? Because the sound of the leaves is the same as the sound of the wind, is the same as the sound of the land. And it's this kind of whiteness everywhere, this kind of blur where everything collapses into one another. And what do we see? We see nothing. We see nothingness. So what is this nothingness is the question, right? And again, we get this kind of subject-object thing going on. We get the subject, which is the speaker of the poem, and then we get the object, what the speaker is observing. And even those two things collapse into one another at the end of the poem. So the speaker or the reader, perhaps the listener, looks at nothing and in fact is nothing. And I think that, just like Paul Griffin said, this nothingness can be interpreted as in so many different ways. I guess that's the question, right? What is this nothingness? Is this nothingness an actual meaning in itself? I mean, I think this refers to the sort of groundlessness that the modernist poets were so anxious about, this sense that maybe there is nothing, maybe there is no God, maybe there is no soul, maybe there is this nothingness. And it's a very despairing kind of idea, right? But at the same time, if that nothingness is referring to the soul, if it's referring to God, if it's referring to meaning itself, then it is that nothingness that is it. That's it, right? That's what is important. And so, I think it's up for grabs what this notion of nothing means. The other thing I want to point out with the last few lines is, the last line itself, the nothing that is not there. Okay, so there's nothing that's not there. Doesn't make sense. It's kind of a paradox in a sense. And the nothing that is. Now, is the nothing that is, does that mean the nothing that is not there? Or the nothing that is there now? Or does it mean the nothing that is, period? Not is there, but just is. It is something because it's nothing. You see, so there's two kind of meanings of that last, and the nothing that is. Because it could be read as, and the nothing that is there, as opposed to the nothing that's not there. Or it could be read, the nothing that is, the nothing that actually exists. Okay, and in that sense, there's a kind of, perhaps, hopefulness if this nothingness is meaning itself, is the soul itself, is human consciousness itself. Okay, so as I said, a very philosophical poem, a very beautiful poem. I love it. Okay, that's all for now. Thank you for listening.